Welcome everybody to Tritype Part 5. Tritype refers to a 27-point typing system that is an advanced and more specific application of the Enneagram that was created and coined by Enneagram teacher, researcher, and coach Katherine Chernick Fauvre. Tritype, originally named Tritypes, Trigrams, and Tricenter, is based on Katherine's theory that while individuals primarily use one Enneagram type as their core type, everyone actually uses 3 Enneagram types. The dominant Enneagram type within each center of the intelligence. The head, which is 5, 6, 7, heart, which is 2, 3, 4, and gut, which is 8, 9, 1. These 3 types are used in an oscillating, repeating, descending, and hierarchical stacking order.
Well, one question that people ask over and over again is how do they know which type in their tritype is their core type? And I think what might be unclear is that when I say it's in a descending stacking order, the type at the top of the stacking is your core type. So you never lose your core type. You're just learning your dominant type in the other 2 centers, but they're in a hierarchical order as well. In fact, that was the first question. How do you know the difference? Another question that is asked is, how is tritype different from Enneagram type? Spencer, do you want to take a shot at that?
I usually use colors to best explain this. Originally, imagine if you were just being told you were red, you were blue, you were green, right? That's still very helpful and descriptive. But with tritype, when you add 2 other numbers, it's like a green that also has a little bit of purple and a little bit of white, right? So it makes it a specific kind of green, which in itself is no longer called green. I actually specifically, maybe my mom would know, but green, purple, and white together has a whole other name to itself. It's no longer just green. But green is still the dominant color and is still a type of green. Whereas if purple was the dominant color and there was still green and white, so same 3 colors, it's actually not a different type of green anymore. It's a different type of purple because it's a purple that is green and white. So it further specifies the type of purple, further specifies the type of green, and it has a whole other name onto itself, even though it has the same 3 colors.
Well, does anyone get that he grew up with the color theory and not just the Enneagram? You know, the other thing to remember is that with the Enneagram, it's a 9-point system, but based on the divisions of 3, everything in a pattern of 3, trialectic. Well, tritype is divisible by 3 as well, but it's a 27-point system. So what's the distinction? The 9-point system of the Enneagram identifies 9 points, whereas the 27-point system of tritype is recognizing 3 points for each person. So the 3 times 9 equals the 27. So basically, they're both divisible by 3. You can use them separate from one another, but together it's really powerful because it explains nuances and differences within type that couldn't be explained by instinct or wings or lines of connection. And it just emerged quite by itself, just doing qualitative research. And with my first test, I had the Enne style questionnaire that you all filled out if you took my test. And then I had a test where I had the idealized image and the core fear of the 9 types by center and began with type 2. So 2, 3, then 4, then 5, 6, and 7, then 8, 9, and 1. And they weren't labeled by what they were just A, B, C, D, E, etc. So when people filled that out, I was astounded that they actually chose a type from each center. Now, they may have chosen 4 types and not just 3, as is very common with 9 and 6, but it's not like there were 2 heart types and 2 gut types and no head types. With that particular testing instrument, I called it Enneagram Type Sorter, it was set up in such a way that people would naturally set up the hierarchy, and they ultimately had to have all 9 types ranked. But that's how I noticed this pattern, because it was person after person after person. I said, that's not random. And many of these people knew nothing about the Enneagram. And those that did only knew the fundamentals. Just think about the timing. In 1994, we just had the first Enneagram conference. We had different teachings and teachers within the Enneagram. Some people knew subtypes, others didn't. Some people identified using wings, others didn't. And all these different transmissions of the Enneagram. So the first kind of intention was to get everybody together, the teachers, and see what the common descriptions were. So if you put that in perspective, it was extraordinary that people could identify their idealized image and core fear, because that was not anywhere in any book. So it was simply people assessing and comparing and contrasting, which is the fundamentals of the Enneagram. So it's a great question. The follow-up question was the one about the core type. And what was asked in addition to that is, what does it mean for the other 2 types? Like if you have your core type, which many people identify with if they've learned with me or with others, but then they kind of stall because it can seem overwhelming to have more than one type, because they don't realize that you're just choosing the dominant type in each center and ranking it. And then you take those 3 dominant types and rank those. Once they realize that, people feel much more at ease about it. But at first, if they don't know, they think, oh no, it was hard enough finding one type. How am I going to find all of them? And what about the wings? And what about the lines of connection? And what about integration, disintegration? Well, the first thing is we have to explain the problem with integration, disintegration. You want to try that, Spence? What was wrong with it? Why does it interfere with the process of typing or the Enneagram itself?
I imagine that what you're asking is because in truth, in our high side, we actually go to the high side of both of those numbers. And during stress, we go to the low side of both of those numbers. So the issue originally was that this number was identified as going this direction in health and this direction in distress, which, wasn't inaccurate. It was just half accurate, because we went to both health and both distress in distress, which really, really made a lot more sense, because I remember thinking to myself, well, but I also do the kind of distress sides of 2 as well. I don't just go to 5, right? And then when I'm being helpful, I don't just go to the high side of 2. I also am really good at compartmentalizing and like kind of like taking the emotions and be like, okay, so let's just figure this out. So it really just gave half the information, which is not accurate.
I remember noticing that too, Spencer. And of course, you were there from the very beginning. You were in utero when I learned the Enneagram, but you literally grew up with it. And as I was learning more, then I was, of course, sharing that with you. And then you shared it with all your friends. And then we typed all your friends from a very young age. Spencer Brandon made them all 6s because he was a 6.
Makes sense.
And the reason people do that is if someone matches, you think, oh, that person's like me. But usually the types that do that are those that are lining with you or trying to be in sync with you and to match you. And the type that does that most of all is the 9. And the 9 can really accurately mirror you and not need to be the individual. And 6s want to be and we're talking children here, but adults are the same. They want to be kind of one with the other person and match so they belong, meaning that they will never be separate from the person when they learn this system. So it's really quite common. Just as with the color theory, I took crayons, the big box of 64 crayons, to Spencer's preschool class. And I brought the children in one at a time, and they chose the 3 crayons they liked the best. And I always worked with patterns of 3 even then. And what happened is the children would choose their favorite colors. There was no problem. Then I brought in all the little children. How many kids do you think were in your class, Spencer? Like maybe, did I do both classes together? I think I did both classes together. And I was just always researching or testing something. But I had a hypothesis that we're influenced by friends and family, or those we care about, or those we're a little cautious around, that we are influenced in our choices and that we could modify them. And I had noticed this with colors, like people would identify with a color that could be beautiful, but it wouldn't be their color. And upon further inquiry, I would find out that their mother loved red roses, that kind of orange red rose. And so they loved it because they loved their mother. And that's an identification as opposed to what maybe would match them. But when you could help someone understand, okay, that's an emotional attachment, that's meaningful. But if you hold up those 2 colors, and I'd pull swatches, which one do you think looks better on you? And then they would think the color that they actually are, because we're innately attracted to it. But my point is, when I brought the children all together and I gave each child the crayons that they liked, the colors that they liked. In fact, I gave them the whole set, but at that moment I gave them 3. And then people started changing their color. This friend thinks red is the best. Oh, I'm red too. I need a red crayon. It was fascinating. So when I came back and did the same kind of thing with the Enneagram, same pattern. So there's really something to wanting to consciously, and in some types unconsciously, fit in, find a way to belong. So when we later did instincts with these children, they were the social instinct. Or I found that the sexual instinct would want to match their best friend, just plain and simple. But the assertive best friend wouldn't change their color. The more, in Hornevian terms, the more adjusting, appealing, dependent, or negotiating person changes to match. So if they're a 6 in particular, they would change. 9s could change. And anything in the 3, 6, 9, but because the 3 is an initiating type, they were less likely, but they would check it out. So it was fascinating. And I did the same thing with a little story I wrote for Spencer when he was having nightmares when he was about 3, I think. And I did the same thing with the children, how they felt. And I read the story. I brought it in with and gave them crayons again with their little, and a t-shirt with the name of the story. You know, what did they think of me? Especially your mom's always coming in doing some sort of research.
I've never thought about it until you're retelling it right now. I'm just like, that was totally normal to me. And now that I reflect, I'm like, yeah, that's very interesting.
And that the school was totally good with it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, totally.
But it was fascinating to see this be congruent. I'd already seen it as a executive in the cosmetic industry where I had people under me in, in a downline, so to speak, and above me. But at one time or another, I could be responsible one way or another for people from Alaska to Hawaii and Denver West initially. That's a lot of people. And I was able to do the Any-Style questionnaire. It was not called the Any-Style questionnaire. It was just the interview questionnaire that I created. But it worked so well. And I had found out so much about people when I was interviewing them, when I was hiring them, or if they were a new hire and I didn't interview them, to get to know them. And that is the first part of my test. So even if you don't have someone who'll take the whole test, write down those questions and ask them those questions, because we will answer it according to who we are, even if we're concealing what the true answer would be, because we want to say what is the best thing about us. And if it's a difficult thing, we're going to want to say it in a better way, because we don't know how the questionnaire is going to be used, especially now that it's online. In person, they knew I was going to do it and I was going to tell them about it. But online, a lot of people don't know who's going to see it. They don't know I don't sell anything to a third party or do any of that. But it's not necessarily exactly what the types are. It's what the type said about themselves. So then the follow-up question to that is, how do you know? Everything I read in the descriptions, there is something that I relate to or identify with, and other things I don't. So how do I choose the cards? Now, in the instructions, I told them to choose what was true for you most of your life, most of the time. And people still, it just went over their heads, and that's normal. It's meant to. But then they would be kind of confused by their answers. Some people would look at the Enneagram cards, and one word would be so important because they liked it or hated it that they would either throw it out and not consider it or choose it. But the directions were to look at the whole card and all the words. And so some people take it over to just see if they would answer differently. And others say, well, if I know my type, I can't possibly do well on a test. Yeah, you can, because you still have to make a choice. It doesn't matter whether you know the types or not. So I've had people that the test will give them the asterisks like 6 or 9, and they'll say, but why? How could that be? And I said, well, because I programmed that test after watching thousands and thousands of people take the test in person with me, or on the phone, or on Zoom, where they're showing the card. And even if I'm there or I'm here and you're there, we still did it. And when they hesitated, what questions they asked and why. So ask yourself, if you would try to choose, let's say, 8 cards, as with Spencer, because he knew he was an 8, because you're an 8, or would you just look at the questions and answer it with fresh eyes? The 6 and 9 have trouble with that. And it's not that they don't know themselves, it's they look at everything as a condition, and they're meant to. 3, 6, and 9 are all meant to look at the circumstances, the context, etc. So Spencer, when you're working with a client and they're a new client and they've taken the test, how do you tell them when they're, well, you'd have the asterisks as well to know, but so that they understand that they're testing, differently from what they chose? How do you introduce that possibility that they could be actually leading with the 6 or 9?
Well, exactly. I use the asterisk as an indicator. A real slam dunk is when the primary number is not inside of the tritype. So it's like you tested as a 7 with the tritype of 682. Like that's usually like a really big indicator. But my typical process is no matter what, whether I see asterisks or not, I ask them to give a rating of 0 to 100% accurate, how it feels for them most of their life, most of the time. If they don't say 100%, which is not required, right? Some people, maybe they have some life experience that made it so that they already have worked out of what that typical tritype does, so they don't associate with one part of it, and that can happen. But more often than not, what happens is they'll be like, oh yeah, this is like 85, 90%. And I'll be like, oh, okay, cool. Just real quick, what was the 10% that you didn't, the 10 to 15% that you didn't connect to? And then they'll actually highlight specific sentences in that, tritype paragraph. And then that will actually really help me. I had a most recent client tested as actually type 7, but with a 6 to 8 combo. And when I sent the 6 to 8 combo tritype description, they said that they didn't connect to breaking the rules, and feeling like a justice fighter kind of thing. And so I was like, oh, okay, so what other tritype, when you put those together? And instantly I knew to get rid of 8. Like 8s pretty much connect to, like, I follow the rules that I connect to kind of thing. And then so I sent the description of 269 and it was 100% connection. So that's my most common thing. But I explained it to them being like, oh yeah, because there's this thing called survey bias, where we answer questions based on what we want the answer to be, but it's hard to distinguish between what we want the answer to be and what we actually think the answer is. We're so used to thinking that someone can see our answers and will judge, not to mention, as we're putting the answers down, we are judging ourselves. Sometimes we don't like that we feel like we are insert thing, but we don't like that because of whatever reason. We don't want to identify with that. So we answer differently, whether we know it or it's unknown to us because it's a defense mechanism. So I just kind of bring to their attention, oh yeah, but in the end, it's just getting the right number. So that way, we find the right tools so that it's working, smarter, not harder, blah, blah, blah. I just really make it not a big deal. And then they attach to it.
Excellent. And Spencer's done his own research too with the Enneagram and conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And so together we've got about 25 different studies, and there's going to be a new one on the Enneagram and the MBTI types. So the personality types, the 16 types with the Enneagram. Now I did that 2014, 10 years ago almost, but you really need a huge sample to be able to look at the 27 tritypes and the 16 types. So I'm really hoping that we can get it out to enough people and find out more about these categories, because there are things we expect and things we think wouldn't be an MBTI type that we think would not be, like an 8, for example. People say, oh, ENFPs would never be an 8. Well, actually, that's not true. It's more that the Enneagram type leads, and then the MBTI becomes a flavor of the type. So it's wonderful to be able to do that and add that. But the next question is Tritype, like the Enneagram, based on motivation? Spence?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Obviously, I'll give a longer answer than that, but the answer is absolutely. Just imagine, instead of identifying one source of motivation, you identify additional sub-sources of motivation. In the end, you still have your primary type, so that's what's driving the bus the most. But you've got these passengers in the back that are also yelling to the bus driver, other things that are important to decide where the whole entire bus goes in the end and what actually drives it.
Yeah.
So they all add to the motivation. As much as I want to avoid being weak, I also want to avoid being inadequate. I also want to avoid being, not belonging. Or I part of me wants to believe I'm not afraid, and then I have this other part of me that's afraid of fear itself. It's like this. It's all of it. All of it's driving all at once. And it's easiest to see when all three numbers are cohesive, and they all see it the same. Kind of like planets aligning, just like boom, just the light shines through a lot easier. But it's always happening. It's just whether there's a conflict that makes it harder to see.
And two things can happen. You could have a tritype where they share so much in common that it can be hard to determine the lead. But you will find it if you listen to the vocabulary the person uses, even if English is the second language. The other thing that can happen is you can have a tritype with maybe two that share a lot in common, and one that's kind of an orphan compared to the other two. I have that with my tritype, for example. 8 and 7 are of the same mind most of the time. They want to go after what they want, when they want, and they want plenty and variety. But to have 4 as well, it's like the 8 and 7 say, yeah, don't complain about that. Don't worry about that. Who cares whether you're an individual or not? Because 8 and 7 see themselves as individuals. So when that happens, and our third type in particular is at odds with the top 2 types in your tritype, then you know that it's there. It seems eclipsed, but it's really operating as well. And that's when I really came to know that it isn't just that we have these 3 types. It's that our head type is 5, 6, or 7. Our heart type is 2, 3, or 4. And our gut type is 8, 9, or 1. And this is true for all of us. But in 1994, that was very audacious because people still felt that the lines of connections covered everything and gave everyone a head, a heart, and a gut. But it doesn't. If you look at the Enneagram symbol, 7 has no line to the heart, and 2 has no line to the head. Now, there are plenty of types that don't have a line, but they can sort of get to it by a wing. That just wasn't kind of a fully balanced system if we're going to start thinking about what people do. But that particular image of the Enneagram is creating the law of 1, wholeness, unity, and the law of 3, 3, 6, 9, and the law of 7, 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7. If we put those 3 elements together, we get the Enneagram that we've all seen. But that is the Enneagram of movement. It is thought to combine the divine with creation, and that it's deliberately aligned like that because of the 3 laws it employs. And I believe that's why Gurdjieff chose that particular Enneagram, and probably Echazo as well. Having said that, in like early 1300s, there was a 9-pointed Enneagram that showed every connection from every type to every other type. And it was based on divine qualities. But that was not easy to find prior to probably maybe even as late as 2010. But if you knew the work of Ramon Lole, or Lowell, then you would have seen that. And it still had 9 points. So the important thing is Enneagram is a 9-pointed graph or image. But where those points are and how they do or don't connect can vary depending on what you're looking at. So in the case of Tritype, I just had every type connected to every other. I had not seen Lully's work at that time. It was not on the internet. I didn't have the books that would have introduced that to me. I just realized that every type had something similar to every other type and something exactly the opposite with each other type. Now, tests have been made using that theory, where you're given opposite and you have to choose, or you're given ones that are similar and you have to choose, or both. And as a result, we're able to kind of get to what we may or may not do. The problem with testing instruments, all of them, is they're really only as good as the person's self-awareness. And many people will ask for help. And now that it's on the internet, they'll go and look up a thesaurus, or they'll wait and ask their friend, their maybe several people, what words they would use to describe them, which is perfectly normal. But that's new, because before they were in front of me, they couldn't go get a thesaurus, and they didn't get extra directions or to go email someone else. So it's been fascinating learning what people do to try and handle that. Have you noticed that too, Spencer, with your clients, that they ask their spouse or their friend or their parent or all of them?
Yep. Absolutely.
And if we know that, we know what to ask them. So I always ask people, well, how did you choose your 5 adjectives? Oh yeah, I asked my kids, or I said, okay, what would you say? I said, well, that's great if you want to know the type of your kids, but it doesn't help you. And people go, oh, right. Yeah. And the reason being is that we're identified literally with identifications. And we're looking at behaviors and descriptions, which is normal. The Enneagram is the only typology that's based on motivation, not a description. So the more detailed a description is with the Enneagram, there's a greater possibility of mistyping. So anyone that's creative might like a Tritype that has the word creative in it, and they may not have a creative type. They might just be a creative person. So all of that's important. And if you're looking at your own test, but you're looking at your friend's test, you want to always ask them why they chose that word. What was it about the card? And then you find out the motivation, why you do what you do rather than what you actually do. And that is so hard to overcome with a 3, 6, or 9, because they are they're hardwired to adapt and kind of hold both their wing types. So if someone has 3, 6, or 9, they can readily identify with all 9 types, and they're meant to. But here's the important distinction. If someone's a 9, they see all points of view. They can identify with every Enneagram type, but they remain unconvinced by any. So it's pretty key. Okay, now the next part was, what does the mental center help us do, and the emotional center and the physical center? Well, it's pretty simple. The mental center is how we make decisions, how we weigh and measure what's important. That's why on the 6, you'll see the pros and cons. And then the beliefs that we have. And that's where our fixation will be, in our head type. Fixed, rigid belief. What have you noticed, Spencer, with your clients where they lead with the head type? Is it easy for them to make decisions, or are they always checking and rechecking and making certain that they've got the right answer, or both?
I mean, I guess it depends the weight of the dilemma or the decision, if they are indifferent or not. It just depends how much it's activating their anxiety. Obviously, all three responds slightly different, all driven by a desire to know the information, but they do different things with it. But I find with 6, it's hard to make the decision because they don't want to make the wrong one.
Exactly.
5s don't want to make a decision if they don't think that they're informed enough. They want to know if they just want to make a decision that, feels intelligent and thought out, and and all that kind of stuff. 7s are the interesting one, because it really depends on what they're combined with. But a lot of times it's kind of like it'll, like, life will decide it for me, the universe will, kind of thing, and they'll just pick based on like fun or based on excitement, or if it avoids the negative. So it just depends on the specific situation. But if you lead with the head type, I do notice that you kind of stay in that head place a little longer before you can move on to the gut or the heart.
Such a good point, Spencer, because of course I'm noticing if they hesitate, even
Right.
just asking questions during the typing interview. Now, I'm not talking about being reflective to answer a question, but to kind of stop what they feel, they're visceral and they just answer right away. And a counterphobic 6 can do that, but it's something they've already worked out. They already know if this happens, I'm going to do that. But there will be a nanosecond of checking. The 8s just going about their life, and then something is like not quite right. And it's like, say what? So we go from nonchalant to asserting, to set the record straight, to one way or another have things represent the truth in the way we believe truth is. Having said that, all of us are using our head center to know what we need to know or learn what we need to know to survive. And so the 3 head types are trying to figure out the best way to get the knowledge that will keep them safe. And that wasn't in the early dissemination of the Enneagram that went out from after Naranjo. So what happened is that Naranjo attended Echazo's course. He actually met him the year before. And then he studied with Echazo in Chile. And then he gathered together 54 Americans. He was one of them. And the first Enneagram intensive taught by Echazo was July 1st, 1970, just to give you a point of reference. The Enneagram of Personality began officially at that time, and it was a 10-month intensive, not like 5-7 days, which is huge and amazing. You learn a lot, but living it and working with it. But Naranjo came back to Berkeley and he evaluated what he knew as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and added in details for the descriptions of Echazo's 9 types. So really, at that point, there was a second dissemination of the Enneagram right there, because Echazo liked Naranjo's additions, but then they kind of had a falling out, and he decided he didn't want the psychology in there, so took much of it out again, where Naranjo believed that you couldn't separate the two, and that if you understood the psychology of the type and could recognize the way in which you were kind of defending against reality, then you could make a better leap, a higher leap of understanding. And both are phenomenal, but they became two different Enneagrams at that point. In fact, the Chazos was called proto-analysis. And it's like really analyzing the individual and what are the messages that you listen to that you want answered to feel secure in the world. And in 1972, they added Naranjo and a Chazo. At the end of 72, they added fixations. But prior to that, it was vice and virtue. So passions, vices, and virtues, which were kind of used by all spiritual traditions. And if you really understand that, then it makes sense that the passion and the virtue were a balance of each other. So after the fixation was added, there needed to be the higher side of the fixation, which is the holy idea. So the holy virtue, the higher side of the emotional distress. And then along comes Naranjo and he says, well, wait a minute. Some people are a really primitive version of those centers. So he took the three centers of a Chazo, which were called instinctual triads, and he put them under each Enneagram type. So you had the centers, you had the three types in the center, and then underneath that, you used one of the three centers in a really more primitive way. And that's why I called them subtypes. So some people say, oh, there's no such thing as subtypes. Well, actually there is, because the person who created it was using a Chazo's instinctual centers and placing it under each type. It was really genius, because what it did is it gave us the ability to see the higher essential self and the lower self and the more common ego self, which is what a Chazo was introducing. And it was phenomenal. So then we had something that was really adding, because it was a pattern of three. If something isn't a pattern of three, it's really not Enneagram related or Tritype related. So then the next question is, Spencer, what about the emotional center? What does it say about how we express our emotions and why your feelings and values are important to you?
Personal value, what makes them worth it to other people in their eyes, how they want to appear, how they process emotions and present them, what they prioritize in attaining connection, things like that. Those are probably really, really big pieces. And I think those 5 things I think I just mentioned are categories I use to really separate 2, 3, and 4. So I just think that those are really big ones, but obviously I'm sure you have others to add to that. But that's where I really focus.
Yes, because our heart type is really focused on love-hate.
Mm-hmm.
A gut type, it's opposites from the standpoint of black-white, good, bad, right, wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But the heart type is love, hate, and who should we be with to be safe? And then the head type is this one or this one. What data can I get to see if I should do this or this? So it's a calculating, not of emotions, but of thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, Spencer, absolutely. The heart type is how we're going to express our emotions, when, or hold them back, and why.
Mm-hmm.
So
I find there's sorry.
So go ahead with the 2, 3, 4, like you did with the 6, 7, if you want.
Oh, sure. I've noticed that for 2, it's about feeling important, valuable, needed, being, of course they want to feel like a good person, but it's really hard to feel like a good person if you don't feel like you're being seen as a good person. So it's very important for all 3 of these numbers that how they feel about themselves is also how they are perceived. If there's a disconnect from that, that creates a lot of inner conflict. So for the 2, a real easy way to distinguish a 2 is if you put the word good in front of a noun, that's what they're trying to be. The good brother, the good teacher, the good worker, the good friend. It's just really important to be good. And a lot of times what they don't recognize is they associate good with perfect. They don't connect that. They don't give themselves the same room for error that they allow everyone else around them. In fact, where these other people fall short, they're happy to compensate and fill in those gaps so that they can feel good and they can feel secure. And now they feel good because they did that for someone else. But there's this need to kind of make themselves smaller so that other people can have that space.
And have the power behind the scenes by helping someone achieve their goal. And you're hitting on something really important, Spence, and that is that the corresponding fear that goes with the need to be needed is that if you're not needed, you'll be discarded.
Yep.
You'll have no value. And that's true of all the hard types, but 2, a whole chunk of type 2 was left out of the dissemination of the Enneagram. And that means several archetypes of type 2. So we're trying to add those back in again, that it isn't just, oh, I'm a servant, I don't have an opinion. No. 2s are quite dynamic and powerful. They're just able to navigate and manage situations so that people feel good about themselves. Carry on, Spence. Sorry, I just wanted to highlight that.
2s are very, very powerful, and they usually develop a very strong language skill. They learn that compliments are currency, and they understand that by finding what's important to someone and highlighting that in that someone can make that person feel really good about themselves, which is a wonderful feeling for the 2. They really do love being that person for other people. But there is definitely an attachment to utility. They don't seem to, obviously with self-work, they do, but in that generic middle descriptor, I'm not, we're not talking about health. It's just that generic descriptor. Their self-worth is attached to their utility, their use to others. Oh, I'm their friend because I help them move and I'm always there when they need, and blah, blah, blah. And kind of forgetting that the reason they help people move and the reason that they're there when they need is because they're loving and caring and, like they just want to be a good friend. And that's a wonderful quality. And that's worth like all the things. But the moment that they aren't needed, that can actually activate that for sure. Whereas 3, it's about prestige. It's about being revered. It's about possessing the traits that someone else covets. So they will identify what would make, early on in life, 3s learn from either their family dynamic, society, some sort of important source to them, that if you live up to this descriptor, you will be seen as high status. And it's like, okay, cool. Now I am important, right? Now I can feel that, okay. So if it's about, and it's usually, the way I describe it is, instead of like the good blah, 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 like it is for 2, think of it as like you're an actor that just got an acting role. And so someone's like, okay, you are, the romantic lead's best friend. There's a title to that. But instead for 3, it's like, I am the provider. I am the hard worker. There is this title that's associated to the trait that is coveted. And if they can live up to that title, then that inner distress doesn't occur. But if they are the provider, but their money is tied up in something, and then the business has some, legal issue or whatever, and they can't access those funds, and now they need to lean on their partner to help, even though they would want someone who's like, would do that for them, they are now not living up to that title, even though they would want someone who would help them in that time. They don't want that time to ever happen. And now they're not the provider. And if I'm not the provider, who am I?
It's all about who am I? And if I'm
Yeah.
not my idealized image,
Mm-hmm.
I'm nothing.
Yep.
And it's for 2, 3, and 4, but whereas the 2 has to be that good person, a lot of times people can mistype 2s that have 1 in the tritype because of the good.
Yeah.
But 1s don't try to be the good friend, the good,
Right.
they try just not to be bad.
It's not bad.
Not, so
Which
it's
can sound and look the same, but it's not. Yeah.
And the 3 is needing the audience that says they're great. Good isn't good enough.
Employee of the month.
Superb.
First place. Yeah.
They need the wow factor. I remember when I first was doing these interviews in 1994, where it was one person after another. Then it became clear that privately they would say that, well, it's kind of embarrassing, but I need you to see me as an all-star. I need you to say, wow, when you meet me. And so they were quite cute, but they didn't like automatically participate in the study. I had to go find the 3s and get them to participate because they were too busy. They were on task, achieving, accomplishing. Thank you.
Yeah.
And type 4, Spence?
4, so like 2 and like 3, they really want to be seen. I think 2 wants to really be seen even in a different way than 3. For 2, it's really touching to be thought of when they're not in front of you and having some sort of proof that you were thinking of them when they weren't in front of you.
Yes.
4s want to be seen in a different way. They want you to really, really see them, how they fit in, but are different. So it's like how I fit in yet stand out. It's like, you fit in with us teachers, but you're the teacher that comes in wearing costumes and engages the kids in this special way that just other teachers just don't do. It's really being seen for your uniqueness, your specialness, the thing you bring to the table. 4s do not want to stand out. They do not want to be the odd person out, but they also don't want to be seen as everyone else. It's this middle ground where I fit in, but I am recognized for the unique element I bring to the table. And anytime that specialness, that, man, I just can't get that work from anywhere else, I have to go to you for this. It's really, really being seen in that light because that specialness, that uniqueness, that there's like almost belonging to like a special club within that larger club. Like, here, welcome to the bar. Oh yeah, and there's the VIP section, right? And of course 3s want to be part of the VIP section, but it's for the status, like, I've made it with the elite. For the 4, it's wanting to be there. It's like, because like they see that specialness in me. So you can see how there's definitely this Venn diagram where there's this overlap where you can kind of miscue, but it's the way, and the 4 won't identify with wanting to be part of that VIP that the 3 will. The 3 will be just blatant about it. Like 3s like love learning that they're 3s. They're like, yep, that's me. And they just really, really connect to that. Whereas 4s love that you're taking the time to get to know them and understand them. They finally feel seen. But a lot of times there's wounding with the 4 learning that they're a 4 because they learn about the pain that they feel because they can't tell how much is their pain and how much is the other person's pain because they introspect so much. So it's I want to be seen as something special to you, right? The 2 wants to be the good thing to you. The 3 wants to be like the high status thing to you, but the 4 wants to be special. There's something they just can't get anywhere else except from you.
Whereas like the 2 needs to be the special friend, the special teacher, the special person. Like all heart types want to be special.
Mm-hmm.
But the 3 needs to be the special that's big. There's something definitely they're going for as an audience, not just an individual. Like the 2 will make the connection. And the 4 has to be special in an elite way. Has to have exclusivity. So ironically, by finding their unique qualities and identifying with those, it separates them from others, which in some ways feels good because they're more exclusive, but then it immediately sets them up to not be in flow with others the way they want to be. Because how can you be part of a group if you have to be singular within a group? So that's how the 4 struggles.
Yeah. And the last thing I would add is the need to feel like and be perceived as emotionally advanced. They've done the self-work to be emotionally attuned. They know themselves. They've done the deep work and they're continuing to do so and won't stop. It's about this emotional growth and being seen as an empath and the depth. It's really important that you understand the emotional depth. Not unlike the 5, but instead it's cerebral. They want to be seen as very advanced in terms of how they conceptualize things and can make sense of things and identify systems and break them down. So when you have someone with a tritype with 4 and 5, they want to be seen as emotionally advanced as well as highly intellectual. So this person in general with the 5-4 combo, like, kind of wants to be seen as the whole package. So it's the emotional advancement, and they've done the work and they're continuing to do so. That is also kind of particular to 4.
And spiritual. They will identify
absolutely
whether they're in a traditional structure of a religion or they're finding something more obscure. They are identified with their connection, and in a way their fall from grace, how they had something and lost it. So the 2 is saying, I know how to get it back. The 3 says, if I do the best, people will want me and include me. And the 4 says, even if I do my best, I can miss the mark. And so the focus goes to what's missing with the 4, where with the 2, it's what can I offer here? What can I give to make everybody happier? So the 2 is more positive, and they kind of disown when they're negative, because all human beings are both positive and negative. And the 3 kind of disowns that they're modulating their feelings and their actions, and that life is a stage. And when they realize that, it's kind of like a collapse. And you'll see on the 3 board in the top left corner, there's a guy going like this, and people say, wait, how is that 3? The other 3s are like, yeah, looking at my watch. And well, because underneath the performance that could be superlative is someone that is afraid that they won't have the relationship they need that will mirror to them they have value. So think of, in Achazo's first grouping, he called the 2, 3, and 4 relation. And so what kind of relationship do we have, which is why it's love-hate. And then the 5, 6, and 7, he changed it to adaptation. Like, how do we adapt to fit in, to get the knowledge or information we need to survive? And the 8, 9, and 1, it's conservation. Well, what do I need to hold on to? And it's a historical ego. It's like remembering where to go to get what you need to have the fundamentals of life. And maybe it's remembering that there's a peach tree that blooms at this time of year. So think of symbolically, like with all things being equal, what do you do to get what you need? And we're going to use all 3, but we can really gain a lot by how. You want to do the self-preserving, Spence?
You mean gut?
The same thing, yeah. Gut.
Yeah, in what way? What am I highlighting about those?
Like if you lead with a gut type, what, like 8, 9, and 1, the distinctions between 8, 9, and 1, because then we'll go from there to see how tri-type
Is when
really
you combine the
is.
different things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Okay, okay. I know that there's several ways to do this, but for me, it's a connection to anger. I have noticed that with 8, there is a lot more comfort with the anger, and they will more let that flow. It's more upon reflection that they go, maybe I should have paused and assessed further and pulled back and yada yada yada. And there can be 8 wounding. I certainly know I had it, where I developed a habit of trying to make myself small and not, and I was mistyped as 7 and 9 like all the time, because I would basically lean on these 2 wings because I didn't want to like dominate someone's birthday or like whatever. It's just like we can just really kind of take up space. But when it comes to anger, we see it as a tool. It's what fights for justice. And like, hey, that's not fair, and no, it's like, and we're comfortable with it. 9 is essentially the complete opposite. 9 would like to believe that they don't get angry at all. There's this desire to be, whereas the 8 is desired to feel like and be perceived as the protector, the strong one, the one that will act and do. The 9 wants to be a very stable force, very steady, the calm waters. And so by getting angry, they would disrupt the harmony that they so very much seek. Not to mention, they can't say anymore, oh, I'm easy, I go with the flow, I'm chill, I'm laid back, right? These words would be disrupted if they were to engage in that anger. So they tend to suppress and suppress and suppress. I typically refer to the 9 as the sleeping bear, because eventually they get poked one too many times, and then they give you all 50 of the times they were poked. But because they didn't mention the first 49, the other person is bewildered by this juxtaposition of what they expect from this moment versus what's actually occurring, which of course feels incredibly invalidating to the 9 and shows them why they shouldn't get like this, and feeds the loop of why they don't connect to that anger. Because see, anger's aggressive and destructive and throws off everything, and people just get upset, and it doesn't really do anything good. It just disrupts harmony
And causes separation, their core.
Exactly. So they're not seen as a stable force anymore. They're seen as reckless or whatever. So they'd rather just believe they don't get angry at all. And for 1, it's kind of in the middle. They too don't want to get angry. They recognize they get angry, but it's all about the presentation of that anger. They want to be socially correct, politically correct. They want to be ethical and professional, and they want to be seen as controlled. So they will control their anger and try to control how they behave, because they don't want to feel like they've lost control. Because these are guides, these are instructors, these are teachers. These are the ones they want to teach you the ethical and right way to do things. A lot of times when people consider ones controlling, they are not. They are actually trying to help you and guide you to what they truly believe would be best for you. You just need to listen. Just let me show you the way. This will get you there easier, faster, whatever. And they're not really trying to be dun, 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 dun. It just can kind of feel that way. But it's by connecting to that anger, it really just it makes them want to kind of manage the moment even more. So they engage like an 8 would, but they don't want to address the full anger like a 9. So it's the kind of this in between where it's all about regulation, not realizing that they're still kind of not letting it flow. Now, of course, there are pros and cons to all 3 of these that I've mentioned. But in the end, it is their connection to anger that I've noticed as the biggest separator for all 3.
And all are angry, and the 9 is the center of the whole system. So they have the most access to anger, but bury it.
Mhm.
Show it in a sport or in a competition where it's okay, but anger could be what they don't do. In fact, usually with 9, it's not what they do, it's what they don't do, what they withhold. And
Yeah.
that's why if they're intellectual, they can think they're a 5 at first. So if they're introverted and somewhat awkward with people, and they know they withhold, so, and they're withdrawn like the 5, but they don't need to leave. They can stay in a really uncomfortable situation and just go away.
Boom.
The lights are on, but no one's home. Whereas 5s can't do that. I'm out of here. And I'm
Yep.
not going to tell you I'm going to leave, because then I'll have to explain it.
Sure.
And
Irish goodbye. Mhm.
I don't want to, I need to leave. And then they can later say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't say goodbye. But it wasn't that they didn't want to be polite. They didn't want to be talked into staying. They didn't want any restrictions, where the 9 would just say, okay, and just endure. 5s don't endure. Both 5 and 9 pursue doggedly what they're interested in. And it's information and the knowledge that will keep them independent for the 5. But the really smart 9 was lost in the dissemination of the Enneagram, which is really interesting because Chazo was a very, very smart 9, very intellectual 9. And as a result, when that kind of slipped and was no longer in the dissemination, 9 was kind of talked about as basically someone that was unconscious and didn't connect to anything and just wanted to eat or sleep. And I'm not saying they don't want comforts, they do. But there are intellectual 9s. And what's so great about Tritype, and when I observed it and it became visible to me, I thought, that explains a whole category of people that were atypical, that didn't match their type. And that's when I first saw the countertypes. And I thought, I wonder why Naranjo only had counterphobic 6. And then when I met him 2 years later, after I first shared my research, I asked him, I said, are there countertypes for all the types? And someone said, no, is there a counterphobic version of every type? And I go, no, that's not what I'm saying. Counter to the most obvious expression of the type. So it seems like they mistyped all the time. And Naranjo had not thought about it. And he said that he came up with the counterphobic 6 in his Seekers After Truth that began in September of 1971. And there were just these 6s that were so, kind of pushy, and then would kind of backpedal, but they seemed like aides, but they weren't. They were still motivated by a fear, and the fear is being afraid. So if you don't want to be afraid, how are you going to recognize that fear is your driver? So that's when he added the counterphobic 6, so that people could begin to understand this perspective. And so then in 1996, when I was doing the intensive with Naranjo, he loved my subtype research, largely because he wasn't given credit for it. People don't realize that, but his work was attributed to Echazo. So anyone who taught the subtypes thought they came from Echazo. Not true at all. And when I actually was in the intensive with Echazo, there were hundreds of people, and I asked all of them about subtype. Not one knew it, not a single one, because Echazo didn't teach it. And they didn't go pursue the Enneagram in general. They were really studying with Echazo as the mentor, the guide, teacher. So there were fives that kind of studied the history. So that's important to understand. And then when we were going through the subtypes, there were 78 people and a really, really interested group. And they all wanted to know subtypes. So Naranjo agreed to include it in this 10-day training. And we copied my book. By we, I mean everybody wanted a book to then use when Naranjo gave his definitions. And it was wonderful to consider that people who knew nothing about Echazo or Naranjo recognized and described what we now call the countertypes. The only thing different is that I had them in a stacking order. So it was 1994 that I came up with stacking orders, period, for the types and for the centers. But it took me longer to get people to understand Tritype, what is now Tritype. And so I had to do a lot more teaching for people then to be able to accurately participate in research with that knowledge. And it's grown, and that's why I really hope people participate. But now just think for yourself, if the description Spencer gave and I gave, if it doesn't match what you gave yourself in terms of Tritype, and do you recognize when someone is adapting and kind of shifting what they should do? So for example, the 3 looks at me looking at them. So and then they're ever so slightly adjusting. They're just gently projecting what I might think is the ideal. And they do that with everyone, by the way. And that's how they deliver their best presentation, and they modify it for each person. And the 6 is like doubt. Is it this or what's the other side of the situation? And they can become the devil's advocate simply because they want balance. And if something's too far one way, they have to point out the other view, even if they agree with the answer, but it can't be extreme. Extreme is potentially unconsciously dangerous to the 6. And so they're adjusting what they think. So the 3 is adjusting their emotions, modulating what they feel and giving the right emotion for the right situation. And the 6 is modulating their thoughts to have the right opinion so that things won't be used against them. Now, privately, they might display their opinions, but they're reading how they're received, if they can, if they're capable of it. And the 9 is modulating their actions, what they do or don't do. So whether they act or don't take an action, it's reading the situation. So once you understand that the primary types are like that, then it's easier to see how people naturally mistype.
So for those of you who have been here when we've answered this question before, this is an incredibly common question. So we basically answer it every time because it's asked every time. Can your Tritype change? The answer is no. Your health level, your behavioral understanding of what attains what you're going for and goals and behaviors, those change. But what drives you does not. We just learn over time that this strategy versus that strategy is more likely to get what we are going for. So those things can change, behaviors can change. But deep down, I am still driven by not being weak, by not being inadequate, and not being in a situation where I am in the worst scenario. I'm going to try to figure out what avoids the more negative outcome. That is always going to drive me. But with improved self-work and things like that, my behaviors change and actually make it harder for me to be determined as what type I am, because I'm not displaying the bull in a china shop descriptor of 8, or the, whatever. I can go on with all the numbers, but for time's sake, I'll just stop there. That's what actually changes. But in the end, I'm still trying to attain the very same things. What can happen is how we define a thing, that can change. So what was once important to me, because I saw it as strength versus weakness, like, for example, 8 is typically very afraid of being vulnerable, because that is perceived as weakness. This is me taking down the armor. And now, more than ever, you have a straight shot to the heart and you can really get me. But I have done self-work to identify vulnerability is actually a strength, because to be vulnerable, we must make that choice to be vulnerable. And when I make the choice to be vulnerable, that is me telling you and me simultaneously, yeah, this might suck if you respond the way I don't want, but I'll be okay. I'm strong enough. So because I've redefined vulnerability as not being weak, I now have different behaviors in vulnerable situations. Like right now, I was vulnerable about my feelings about vulnerability, for example. It doesn't hit me the same way anymore because I've redefined what that is to me. So now my weak versus strength trigger is no longer being activated. So it may look like your tri-type has changed, but it has not. You have changed in terms of how you attain those needs.
Or you haven't found your tri-type yet, is really that
That
you're
too.
still in the
That's a very good
process.
point. You could have just had it wrong to begin with. So you're being more accurate. That's a very good point, Mom. Yes.
People have it right, but then other people tell them that they're wrong. And that baffles me too, because they're basing it also on behavior and on the very narrow view of the Enneagram. That's why I'm doing this course on what was lost and left out and missing and or misunderstood about the Enneagram. I think if I don't do it now, it's not going to get out there to people that need it. And you don't know that if you haven't gone to every training and done intensives with a Chazo neuron. You're just not going to see it in the same way, or your own research. If you've done research and you've studied with everyone and you've met with different teachers and teachings, you see how they're different, you see how they're the same, what they've added, what they've misunderstood. Or I remember thinking, oh, if this school just knew this, they would be even better. And if that school knew this, so I always wanted to put it together. And of course, that's what I've done. But it's more complete. It's like the archetypes are fluid, and you don't have a bunch of archetypes for one Enneagram type and then have some types that only have like the servant for the 2. I mean, like just the names alone of the subtypes of 2 will prove that 2 was lost in the dissemination of the Enneagram. Conquest, conqueror, they're strong words. They're not like soft words. And the 2, because they know what they want, they can get bigger, but it's not like the 6 going, it's more like the 2 moves forward with their chest, and they are reading circumstances and they know what's best, or perceive they do, and will claim that position. Now, they can also be extremely supportive and kind, and so they're like 9 and 6 that way, but it's huge. It's easier to retype yourself if you understand what was lost in the dissemination of the Enneagram. And if you happen to be one of those people that has a type or a tri-type where there were key things missing, you might not see it. You really might have to work with someone who knows the fuller descriptions of the type. Okay.
Yeah.
The 4-6-8 tri-type in any order has also been oversimplified that anybody that's emotional and asserts their emotional truth is this Tritype. No, it's like anybody can have emotion, but why? And as Spencer was saying, because he's this Tritype, like the core fear, the idealized image of each of those three types is important. And then the core fear is important, but you must have the defense strategy of those three types. And a lot of people don't understand that the defense strategies were Naranjo taking defense mechanisms and adding it to the Enneagram and came up with a strategy. So it's not pure defense mechanisms at all. It's how they merged with the Enneagram. So there are a lot of people that have material out there because they don't know. They probably just didn't have a chance to study with Naranjo. And those of us that asked quickly got how those emerged. So if you don't display or you can't recognize the defense strategy, then you can't easily know that you're that type. And the same thing with the stacking order is, now you're looking at whether you're 648 or 684. Well, it's going to go back to the idealized image, the core fear, and the defense strategy. Spencer, since you're this Tritype, do you want to talk about what you have been with the core fears?
Sure.
And the idealized image?
Yeah. If you really check in with yourself and track it in future instances, the order in which you engage in your defense mechanisms is a really good indicator of the order of your Tritype. Some people say that, heart types feel, head types think, gut types act. So as someone who acts, then feels, then thinks about it, that's one way that I know that I'm an 8-4-6, right? But more specifically, my instant reaction is to engage in denial, right? That's my primary defense mechanism as 8. Afterwards, I introspect and I take on the feelings of others, and I really struggle to distinguish how much is mine, how much is theirs. So I feel lots of emotion, and I tend to tell myself things about me. And then lastly, I project. And then I start believing that this is what's going on in my outer world. And I start planning and thinking of plan A, plan B, plan C. And I start doing all of those things. So a real good way of knowing your order is really, really looking at the defense mechanisms in, like, if the first one does not work, what do you do next? Or if you've done the first one for a while and it wears thin and you need to lean on your next one, what is the next one? So that's...
And Spencer, you're pointing out something really important I want to highlight. And there are two very meaningful ways to work with Tritype. One is to get the hierarchy that he's talking about now.
Yep.
The other is what happens in terms of confluence when they come together. And it becomes a type unto itself. So he's asking really that you see what you're doing, which is hard to do because it's happening like this and repeating, and you're going to all of them. And yet, by what you say in your language, you can start to hear the types. And that was a real breakthrough with the lexicon of types. So carry on, Spence. Whether you feel, act, acting, feel, and those who hesitate don't realize that they're thinking before they're acting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I didn't really have, I obviously, through further clarifying questions could maybe get more specific, but as a just general way of determining your order, that is what I would recommend. And I agree with my mom. It's not like I'm like in the moment being like, here I am acting and then feeling and then thinking. I mean, I'm a therapist. I have analyzed myself many, many times. And I've also seen myself in clients who have the same tritype, things like that. So there's a lot of self-assessment. Also, the 4 who wants to feel and be perceived as emotionally advanced. I have put a lot of work into this, whether I like it or not. I have really, really thought about this and introspected about it. So having that natural tool in your toolbox as well, this may come maybe a little more natural than maybe some other tritypes, but really just assessing when you are not feeling understood, when you are feeling afraid, when you are feeling left out, or you feel like you don't have a plan to know what to do if these other elements that you don't know how they'll go and how they'll come in, like what do you go through? And really understanding your whole breakdown. This is not only important to help understand your tritype, but it's incredibly important to understand what strategies to use to self-soothe, to cope, to problem solve. It's incredibly helpful to just achieve and attain your goals and your meeting your needs. So I would really start there. And if that becomes, like hard to distinguish, I would really then look at the other things like the core fears. Like what is really, really driving this moment? Where are you getting stuck? And those also would be in order, and that would also help distinguish the order.
Yeah, it's kind of doing a review of first knowing the 3 types in your tritype, what they are, as Spencer mentioned. But with the 4 interjects, it means you're kind of taking in people in your lives, all of them, the positive and the negative. So if you see something out in the world that it even remotely reminds you of a great memory, you're going to be happy. But with interjection, the same is true if there was a negative memory. And it can seem like out of order for some people because it's here. It's a memory that's triggering a feeling that was painful. And that's because even if you don't see that person anymore, even if you think you've dealt with it, it shows up like a concern about something that you say, wait, I dealt with that. And it's because it's an interject. It's living within you. And the person, right, wrong, indifferent, good, bad, is always there until you begin to see the interject. And the way I saw it with people that were 6 and then 4 and then 8 would be that they would, in the same interview, they would talk about something that was really great about a person, and like an hour, 2 hours later, because I used to only do the 3-hour sessions or longer, they would then talk about the same person with the opposite. Like one example in this case was a 4, 6, 8. But she talked about how her father, neglected her. She wasn't special. She wasn't seen. And then if she wasn't, she didn't feel safe. And then if she didn't feel safe, she could be angry or reactive and then say something just to get attention. And later in the conversation, and we all do that, by the way, when we're little kids and we're trying to get what we want or perceive we have to have, and we're not able to have it because our parent doesn't think it's a good thing for us to do. But in the case of this 4, 6, 8 later, she, like 2 hours later, she talked about, the most wonderful experience in her life is how she connects so deeply with her father, and how he would take her for ice cream and they would have their private, personal time. Now, 2 hours earlier, she gave an example of her father as the person that just was not there and neglected her. So what's important to understand if you have 4 in the tritype is they coexist. And your idealized image of someone and your denigrated image of someone are together, and they can come up at any time. So if you have 4 in the tritype, you know what I'm talking about. I have it, Spencer has it, and some of you potentially have it. And it's like saying to yourself, why? It's like the song, the smell, the sound, it's synesthesia, it's feeling like any one of those things leads to the whole mood. And it could be good, or it could bring up something very painful. Now, if you lead with 4, you're going to see that all the time. But if you lead with 6, it just means that when you're doubting or in fear, a nanosecond of fear, you're going to get emotional. And it, of the 648, 468, 864, of all the combinations, the sexual, social 648 is the most reactive. And it's because it goes from the thought to the emotion, like the boiling of emotion, which could be wonderful, or it could be like overspilling with anger because you don't want to feel what's the third type? 8. You do not want to feel weak and pathetic. So if you feel rejected or and then misunderstood and then misrepresented, then you're going to overreact, because it's like the energy becomes liquid and fluid. And yet, of all the tritypes, this tritype is the quickest to kind of reset to normal again. So they're like storms, is what I'm trying to say. But any type can be healthy or unhealthy. Now, if it's 684, there's more of a tendency to diminish the 4's emotional need. But 6 and 4 are both emotional. But when 6 and 8 are closer, it's kind of like what happens to me with 7 and 8. It kind of tells the 4, yeah, kind of shut up. Don't show those emotions. So it's more like trying to hold it down, and anger comes quicker, but it's not as bubbly in an emotional way of overspill. I don't mean bubbly happy. I mean,
yeah.
Well, it could be with a wonderful memory that is deep and meaningful, but 6 and 8 together first, you're going to take an action. And 6 with 4, you're going to go into a feeling. And so that's usually how you can find it. But the idealized image of the 6 is that you're not alone. You're the core fears of being alone. So if you're with someone that you want to be with, and the sexual, then that makes you happy. And then the 4, it's like the fears of being inadequate. The desire is of being emotionally attuned to your mate and your desired other, whomever that is. It could be your best friend. It could be a romantic relationship. It could be being in sync. It could be a parent-child, just a person you're at ease with. And then in this case, the 8, it's the fear of being weak and pathetic, and so weak and pathetic that you can be controlled and at the mercy of injustice. Now, I remember when I first learned to say I was vulnerable, no one said anything. No one did anything. We were in this little breakout group and we were supposed to work on our issue. And I was talking about being vulnerable, and then people just kind of kept talking. I just made myself vulnerable. Now, the first thing you need to know is 8s never use the word vulnerable until they learn the Enneagram, because we don't even let that concept in. It's like fear and weakness was only for people out there. You're not even cognitive that you're operating that way until you learn the Enneagram. But then they said, well, yeah, I'm vulnerable all the time. I go, well, that's the point. I'm not going to show you my weakness and vulnerability. And they happen to be 4s and 6s. So it's kind of interesting. That's your tritype. And then I said, okay, that would be like you knowing you're afraid as a counterphobic 6. Oh, yeah, I don't, I'm not afraid. So I said, see, I'm not weak and pathetic and vulnerable. And then we had a wonderful conversation because they were just used to being vulnerable. So what I'm saying here is please understand that when you first start doing work with your type, it's not like everybody's going to say, great. They're going to kind of say, well, why aren't you doing what I liked before you did this work on yourself? And your Tritype is fiercely protective. If you're the 648, you'd know you're emotional. And if you're the 684, you would know that you're going to get angry quickly so that you don't have to deal with what's upsetting because you're afraid of the emotion taking over.
Mhm.
It's extraordinary the way the 648 will make a repair attempt. So even though you can get intense like a storm, it's like it passes, the sun comes out, the flowers are all water. It's really quite extraordinary. Fierce.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm triple withdrawn. So like my heart's pounding. I don't like being visible, but I have two quick questions I'll try to do. One is, do you notice, and I don't know if this fits in with today, but that someone asked, does your Tritype change? Well, what about your instinctual stacking? Because as I look at seasons of my life, I really feel like that's the case. And then the other unrelated question is, for me, Tritype really helps that whole, what do you do about the arrows when you don't cover all three centers of intelligence? But there are other esteemed teachers that teach about the harmony triads, but I'm partial to Tritype. So I'm just curious if you have any comments about harmony.
But it's one of the Tritypes. So what happened when we first added the Cornavians and they were the antipodes
Okay.
with the center that matched, independent of Chazo and Naranjo, people came up with the harmonics because they were similar. But it's one of the Tritypes. So it's not negating that. We just saw Karen Horney's work right away. I was one of them very early on. And it only worked when we agreed that you had to have a type in each center. So there was a big dispute about whether the aggressive types were, I saw them as the 378, the dominant type in each center that's going after what they want. And there was a whole group of people that thought the aggressive types were the 8, 1, and 3. And I said, but the whole system is based on trialectics. So if there's 2 in one center, it doesn't work. And in the same way, they go, yeah, but 7, they leave. I go, right. They're the withdrawn center, the aggressive withdrawn. So they're going after what they want. There's a problem, they're out of there. And the gut center is the aggressive center, and the compliance center is the heart. And within each center, there's an aggressive, compliant, and withdrawn type. And once you understand, the 9 is the withdrawn aggressive type. The 4 is also the compliant withdrawn. So it's really wonderful to see how they mistypings occur. But if you, again, go trialectic, you can't just make types a certain way. You have to say, what's the center? And then what type in each center is withdrawn, aggressive, or dependent. And by the way, it's all of Karen Horney's work, not a single word. And that's the only thing that happens when we're teaching systems, is it's natural to narrow it down. Okay, who are the dependent types? Well, actually, they're compliant. They're complying to something to get what they need. So the 1 is the compliant aggressive type. But what are they complying to? Social standards. And in the center that's compliant are the heart types, because love, hate. You're like, well, what do you have to do to have the person who's going to watch your back rather than stab you in the back? You've got to have a person that you have twinship with. and that you feel safe with. And what's the primitive version of the heart? Sexual instinct. It's also wonderful. It's like if we understand what came when and why and how, it takes away so much of what can be confusing. And as I said, Naranjo just didn't make up subtypes. He literally saw the primitive version of each by type. And it just was brilliant. It explained why the 4 can be emotionally aggressive, yet they're an introverted type. So it's pretty darn wonderful. But if you have the 9, the 5, and the 4, you end up wanting situations to make you feel comfortable or safe. And as I shared with you before, the most important thing is realizing the expectation, or that you are seen and noticed by what you don't say just as much as by what you do. And then people project all over the shy person that is withdrawn, just like they project all over the 8 who's just kind of sitting there but taking up space. So, and who's going to project? Those that don't know and want to know who you are, and are you friend or foe? So it's going to be the 6s and the socials that really need to know. So they're going to project onto you. So will 2s. 2 and 6 are the 2 hysterical types. They're just from 2 different centers. So you can be pretty certain when someone's like trying to figure out who you are, it's not by something you've done, it's by not putting them at ease. That's what I was told. Like if I walked into a room and I couldn't really see people, well, I might just be looking for a friend I was supposed to meet, and I might go right over someone that smiled at me, and I wouldn't know they smiled because I was actually concentrating on where my friend might be, let's say in a group or an event. And then later I might be seated with that person. We'd have a really good time at lunch or dinner or whatever the event was. And the person would usually say, "Oh, you're really nice." I'd say, "Wait, was I not nice? I mean, what would you even say that?" You know, and then they invariably would say, "Well, you didn't make me feel comfortable." And I said, "Wait, how did I make you feel comfortable or not comfortable?" And then they would say something to the effect, "Well, I smiled at you and you didn't smile back." And I said, "Did I see you?" "Well, I think so." I go, "Where was I?" And they said, "Oh, across the room." I said, "Do you really think that someone can always see across a room?" And then I explained what I was doing, but I heard that time and time again. So it was not a one-off. And so I thought, oh, and then people would say, when I wasn't talking with people, I would be animated talking with people. But when I was thinking or pulling information, it was just data. It wasn't interpersonal. But if I talked to someone privately, it'd be totally personal. And that's the sexual. But the gut type in the 8 is not adjusting. So we can look angry when we're just like in neutral and we don't mean to, but that is projected onto you as well, because there's strength in the 9. It's like the oak tree, and people feel it, but they don't know why you're not moving towards them to make them feel comfortable. And actually, because you're uncomfortable being overseen, it creates an unconscious dance. And that's what I know most of all, is that we misjudge others when we're just trying to feel comfortable in a situation. So I don't know if I answered your question though.
She had 2 questions.
Okay.
The second question was, does your stacking change order as you reflect on the seasons of your life, I believe is the phrasing that you used. And my answer to that, just like Tritype, no, your stacking does not change order. But what happens over life is that those subtypes get much more highlighted. And I would like you to consider like this following story. I'll tell a really, really quick one. It was Valentine's Day. I'm sexual, social, self-pres. So, and not only am I self-pres last, but like I always joke that the 1 point on self-pres, because I'm 18 sexual, 17 social, 1 point social. I mean, 1 point self-pres. I always joke that I just misunderstood the question because I like don't understand if I'm hungry or thirsty or tired or whatever, like until like my body's like breaking down. And then my wife, who leads with self-pres, have you eaten today? Have you all what? I go, oh no, I haven't. So partly that's ADHD too, but it doesn't help. It was Valentine's Day. I was out, my girlfriend at the time got this like really cool place where, you know, where there was like hot tubs and room and all that kind of stuff. And I got really sick. Something I ate just really messed with me. And even though as a sexual subtype, it's regardless of the conditions, I will connect with you and we will make this a time to be had and something we can look back on and that bonded us and connected us and blah, blah, blah. But I was so energy drained and so not feeling good that if I acted that way all the time, you would have thought I was self-pres. Because in the end, when we were supposed to be hanging out, I fell asleep on the bed and needed to recharge. And I did not prioritize my sexual or my social because that moment, a certain need was so heavily highlighted. It's very common for young children and high school kids to identify as social because it's really important during that time of life to track your groups. It's about belonging, knowing who you are, and by understanding who you are, it's where you belong. As we get older, self-pres becomes more important because maybe health comes into play or our awareness of age or whatever the case may be.
Illness.
So, illness, whatever. And obviously relationship stuff along the way would highlight the sexual aspects. So what I would actually argue is at different stages of our life, one of our subtypes is heavily brought to our attention and reflected and made so important that it's just so that bowl is so much more filled than what we actually lead with, that our attention keeps going there. But if a sexual subtype who is going through like say a health crisis, which would really, really make them very self-pres focused, then starts like losing their relationship because of that health crisis or blah, 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 the natural instinct would be to suppress how obvious it is that I need to take care of myself so that the relationship will stay, because now that has become equally important. And the moment they are equal, this one wins, because that's actually what I lead with. But because of the different seasons of our lives, these circumstances just make that one so much more highlighted. So we will engage in the process because all three are important to us, right? If I literally had no self-pres, I would never feed myself, drink, and I would just die. Like it just wouldn't work.
Homeless.
Yeah, exactly. Like I wouldn't value any of these things. So all three are important. What our stacking really says is all things created equal, all being an issue equally at the exact same time. Which will you address first? Which will you address second? Which will you address third? So in order for me to make sure my friends are okay, I have to first make sure my relationship's good. Now we're good. Now I'm going to go on with my groupings, what's going on. And then after all this, then it's like, am I sick? Have I slept? Right. And so I address those in order. So hopefully that explains that a little better.
Yeah, great. And just kind of related to that, does that mean that that's the same stacking in your tritype for all three?
I tried to have an elegant kind of system where we would stack the centers, stack the instincts, and then we'd have one of each instinct with one of the types. And at an advanced level, that's absolutely true. We do have that, like, so I would be the sexual 8, the self-pres 7, and the social 4. Mine happens to line up. But for a lot of people, it doesn't. And the reason for that is that the instinct is so dominant And that was not known until study participants shared their experiences of when they got triggered. That through the qualitative research, I went, oh, wow, they don't even know each other and they're saying the same thing. And then I also help people accurately type. And then the other factor is that there are times in our lives when it's natural to focus on certain things. So like when we go to school for the first time, first we're self-pres, like, oh, wait, where do we go? What do I do? And then we think, okay, who are the kids? What do I do to participate with the kids? And then out of that, we choose our favorite. So that would be the self-pres, the social, sexual. Then we do that all again every time we enter a new job, a new situation. But which one kind of triggers us the most? For me, it would not having the twin. Like there could be nice kids and I could know where to go and where the bathrooms were and where the cafeteria was. But if I didn't have the person I could confide in and that would confide in me and we could have our own world with the social world, felt incomplete. And that is the issue of sexual. Then there's another factor. If we've had, let's say, a partner and we're doing really well, we might think sexual is not that big a deal anymore because we have that need met. But then if there's a breakup and we're starting over, then it can become really important. We can focus on finding a mate. Like one little piece that I wrote, I think it's on my website or probably one of my blogs, was on how we seem like we change when we seek a mate. So the people that are social want prestige. So they unconsciously focus on someone who can provide that. So they look at self-pres issues. So if someone's financially secure and they're well-liked and they can provide, chances are the status will be good or better. And they don't even know they're doing it, but they're still social. Ultimately, when it comes right down to it, they need to belong as their key issue and belong to the group of their choice. Then the self-pres people kind of, if they're looking for a mate, they kind of spiff up. One person said they like a self-pres 2 said she twinkles up. You know, she might do her hair, wear makeup, or put more time or energy into her presentation. A self-pres 9 said, yeah, you know, I'll make sure, this was a male, I'll make sure I shave, wear cologne, maybe watch what I eat to be more desirable. So they, in those moments, think that they're sexual. But then the minute they go back, they find their mate, they bring their mate home, they just want to stay home. It's comfortable. Self-pres is happy with their home. And if they're introverted, they're very much homebodies. Then the sexual becomes more social, because if you're in search of a mate, where are you going to find them if you don't go out? Now you can do it online, but let's just say historically. And the sexual still doesn't even like online because you don't feel the chemistry, you don't know as much, but it's a starting place. So the sexual kind of joins groups or activities of like-minded people to potentially meet someone. And if they do, they want to be with that someone at home, in the social group. So they become a pair wherever they go. And they don't like split up and go their separate ways. They kind of, for the most part, especially in a new relationship, they are one wherever they go. The two are doing it together. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't someone that merged with another and they're introverted, so they follow the more extroverted person. That can happen. But I'm talking about where the sexual wants to share their world with their intimate, but they still take their person with them everywhere, and not out of insecurity, but it's out of a need to be with the one. And if there is no one, then there's going to be a substitute one. And that could be a good friend that likes something in particular that you could share. But remember that with the sexual instinct, it's going to be with a mate, of course, but long before we have a mate, we're looking for our other half. And it could be our mother, it could be our father, it could be our brother, it could be our next door neighbor. There's going to be someone. And if we don't, we're pretty darn sad about it. But once we find that, we know the feeling. Just as the self-pres says, yeah, you know, romance is great and a good party's great, but so's a hot fudge sundae. So the self-pres person sees all of them as appealing, and, you know, a good relationship, a good talk, but for sure a good bank account will make them happy. But they're equal. They're not equal to a sexual. You'll go without things to have the one. And the social wants to share everything with everyone else. So they're either inclusive or exclusive, because their group of choice becomes what's important. So their ages when we get married. Our broken heart, we're all fours. The first broken heart and any broken heart thereafter, we relate to 4. There are times when it's about, you know, passages of life when it's kind of a time when you might think about getting married. And then there's a time when you think about pursuing your career in a particular way or wanting a family. And it's not that we've changed instincts. It's like these are biological imperatives, and what we do with them is going to be based on our instinct. Does that help at all? So I loved the book Passages many years ago, and then it was updated, but it's still true. There are just certain things at certain ages that we consider. But how? Like, do I want to be comfortable? You bet. Did I always? Yeah, kind of did. And now I'm more uncomfortable than I was at 7 or 8, but the order of dominance didn't change. The most important thing is still the intimate relationship. The closeness I have with Spencer and my best friend, and then they're concentric circles in terms of closeness. And it matters. It totally matters to connect in that way, where socials want that friendly bond. And self-pres wants, yeah, that'd be fun. Let's do that. Then let's go home. So there's still like both going on. And you can be social and antisocial. You can be seeking intimacy or rejecting people that aren't the one. And so there's a spectrum within each combination too. And I call those the identifications. So are we identified with being positively comfortable with our lead instinct and the other two? Or are we negative? If you had a lot of negative social experiences, you're not going to be positively social. You're generally going to be more antisocial and still be social. So that's what changes, the identification based on the experiences, but not the structure. I mean, I really found you can see it in infants, and it turns out to be true when they're 25, 35 years old.
That's very helpful. Thank you both.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. All right, and next we have Abby. Hello, Abby.
Hi, I have two things. I was just going to ask a question, but I wanted to comment on what you just said. As a self-pres, I don't feel like an ice cream is at the same level as what theoretically would be the love of my life. I'm very sad that I don't have the love of my life. With each passing decade, I'm more entrenched in, I just have to have everything I need, all my needs. I can't depend on anyone. And it's like I'm hopeless about finding somebody who matches me. So, and I don't trust, I think of relationships as like, I've always, like, every relationship, I could see the downfall of it from the very start. From the very start, I would walk into these things with my eyes wide open. And so it's like it's foundational. I wouldn't say they're like equal pleasure, like having a bank account is the same as like having, I don't experience it that way. I experience it more as I would feel extremely shaky, extremely insecure if I couldn't take care of myself, because that just seems like reality to me. And like the other stuff sounds like a day at the casino, like maybe
Things
not.
being equal. I have to always go back to what Spencer said earlier. All things being equal, what would it be for you? Like if you had your bank account and you could take care of yourself and you could meet with a friend or have a really enjoyable meal, how would you prioritize who that was with and what you were doing? And do you need to have an intimate conversation, not the interview overview, like where have you been, what have you done, what are your friends doing, your parents doing, your kids doing? That's social. And
Yeah,
then
that is like way at the bottom. Like Spencer talks about the 2 and then self-pres being like a 1 and the other 2 being 17, 18. For me, it's like sexual is a pretty high second, and the social is, yeah.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Spence.
No, imagining them as 3 separate buckets, and one bucket feeling a lot less filled, if not filled at all, your attention is going to go there. Just like the seasons of our life discussion that we had prior, that's going to be more highlighted. It is highlighted for you, which makes total sense, right?
Yeah.
Like that example I gave, even though this was a Valentine's Day date, all I wanted is for it to be romantic, and my 4 was going nuts. Like that's just what I do about the Valentine's Day stuff and things like that. And even afterwards, I felt terrible that I ruined it. Technically, the restaurant we went to did, but there was a bucket that was way less, even though it was a momentary bucket that took priority. Or if I'm just dead tired and I'm in an argument with my partner, the sexual part of me would be like, no, we can figure this out. So what were you saying? And I'll fight to stay awake. But eventually, if I'm tired enough, I will fall asleep mid-argument, when normally I'm like, who could sleep at a time like this? So it's really, really understanding that all things created equal, which will you prioritize?
Yeah.
And it sounds like that sexual bucket is incredibly important to you. You used very heavy terminology, which shows that it's very important to you. So of course, your attention would go there. You're a human being.
I will not risk myself pres for a relationship.
Ding, ding, ding. And that's how you know the order. Even though they're both really high. Like I'm sexual social. Like my social's right underneath, literally 1 point difference. So even though I have 8 and all the kinds of things, I don't really care what people think of me, blah, blah, blah. I also still am tracking other people's. I can't help it. Even though I'm loving the one-on-one that you and I are having, anyone else's faces in the videos, I'm tracking. Are they getting bored? Are they engaged? Are they doing other things? I'm tracking. It's also my 6, right? So there's a lot of things going on there. But
I also, in seeking a partner, I seek someone who for whom self-pres is important, because if it's
Ding,
not
ding.
important to them, I don't feel secure.
Ding, 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 ding. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
we'll forego the partner providing, because the union, fusion, closeness, even if it's impractical, that wins out
Mhm.
over practicality and all the other things.
Yep.
So it's like, we could say, how are we stupid? And we're going to be stupid like our lead instinct, because we will forego something that we should be mindful of, because that need of our instinct and the dominant instinct supersedes everything else. Now, mind you, when Naranjo came up with the subtypes, he thought we had one. Yes, all three were there, but people only had one focus, and that it was secondary to type. The type was the most important thing. But if we put it into context, the way Chazo saw the types was through the lens of what he called instinctual types. So each center was an instinctual center. So primitive. So he already saw that as primitive, but he looked at them as ego types. And part of the confusion with the language is that Naranjo was being mindful of Chazo's copyrights. So he didn't use the same terminology. He used what the terminology Gurdjieff used, which was in the public domain. So there's confusion from that as well. And then when integration disintegration was disseminated, that was a new transmission of the Enneagram, because Chazo and Naranjo never used integration disintegration. Naranjo considered it and put the arrows on the symbol, but then he said, wait, then that would be dialectic. Can't work. And he said in the same meeting, he said, no, it can't work. But the person in that meeting loved the idea of sin and redemption, like knowing your passion or your sin, so to speak, and then the other side of it to counterbalance it. But he went on to disseminate that and went around the world. And people that came down through that line did not realize that Chazo and Naranjo did not use it. Nor do they use that you have one wing over another, because it's continuous. Like the Enneagram symbol itself is continuous. Each type folds into the next type and the type that's previous. So what does that mean? Is that sometimes people know they can do both wings, and other people strongly identify with one wing. And when I was researching, what did come to the surface is that the introverts identify with the more introverted wing. The extroverts will naturally identify with the more extroverted wing. But also, I went beyond with that. And based on the language again, we have one wing that's more internalized and one wing that's more externalized. If it's introversion, extroversion, which it could be, because it was so amazing to see that, you're still always doing both. You can't be your type without doing both. But people didn't know that. The Enneagram was being disseminated without that knowledge. And so that's why they're like really, and we could say levels of health, which are huge and very important, but they were based on integration disintegration. So if they were just calibrated to include integration and disintegration as being both types, integrating and disintegrating, or stress and security, then it becomes accurate again. Just the way Spencer said, it's like half of it. So we don't lose anything, we gain more. But if people are typing others based on integration, disintegration, it's a problem, because you're always doing both. And anyone that thinks about it for any length of time says, oh, right, yeah, I do. Like, I'm not unhealthy when I'm researching. It's like fascination for me. And that's what's motivating me, is the fascination. I didn't need to research. I'm not getting paid to research. I don't make money researching. It's like I want to know. And I'm not just like isolating in 0.5 when I do it. It's more, I want to then share it. It's more a function of my instinct and stacking and MBTI together.
The question I originally raised my hand for was, sorry that us 468s are so demanding, but I just wondered where I fit in this spectrum of, you were talking about like 6, 4, 8 sexual, social is the most emotional, expressive, and then 6, 8 denies. So if you're 6, 4, 8, but you're self-pres, where does that put you in that?
Well, it's like, what are you going to deny? You're going to deny things that are secondary to what your self-pres needs. So that's still going to happen. You're going to try and repress the emotions if it's 684. But if it's 648 with self-pres, you're going to have the emotion, but then you're going to possibly think you just jeopardized potentially something that would give you security, is usually the way I experience the self-pres 648. So they're emotional, but then it's like, oh, I shouldn't have said that or done that, because now I'm going to have some estrangement. That's awkward. That's uncomfortable. Self-pres isn't like that. You do not want to give up the potential of security should you need it. And so the self-pres 6 is usually always factoring in maintaining relationships, because you never know. And yet maybe the self-pres 6, especially if they're introverted, doesn't want to do everything you have to do to make sure you have relationships, so that should you need it, you'll be covered.
The way that plays out, say that last sentence again, doesn't want to do everything.
I tell you, it's a lot of work to maintain relationships, and self-pres 6s are more comfortable keeping their world small enough to manage.
So I can relate to this, because I feel like it's taken me decades to kind of figure this out, but there have been a lot of relationships where I've been like, this is bullshit. I don't need this. I'm out. It's like, I'm doing the work to understand where they're coming from. They never do the work to understand where I'm coming from, ever. I'm fed up. Who needs this? And then of late, I'm feeling like, okay, I don't have, I would like to be authentic with people and for them to get me, but it's not going to happen. So, but maybe it's okay to have these kind of relationships where I get a little bit out of it, so that it's like part of my security to have people in my life, even if they're not like completely, giving me what
Yeah. It's a biological imperative. We need others. Like if we didn't have grocery stores and now even delivery, like if we were in a major physical crisis, like there was an earthquake or a tornado or something, all those things would go away and we'd suddenly have to be more social. We'd have to form bonds to get food when we couldn't find it, to share what we have, to barter. So a lot of us don't realize that, like, to be self-pres, you can get to a grocery store in a reasonable amount of time or resources, but you still worry about it. And that's what's important. Like, and if you're sexual, even if you have a mate, you're questioning, are we as close as the last time? Like, what happened that kind of shifted how close we were? well, I guess we're not as close as we used to be. And that's all going on at the same time that we're with the person, but they could be something totally separate from that that is causing us to feel not as close, or the self-pres to feel not as secure in terms of resources. And people are resources. Like a lot of self-pres people, especially sixes, think of a potential mate, not just as a mate, but as a resource. So then it's upsetting if the mate doesn't provide their share of what's needed to run the household and what have you. So that's why it's so important to consider, would you just leave your security to be with someone that you had that affinity and twinship with? And most self-pres people won't. They're hoping the person they have twinship with is kind of responsible and not going to put them at risk. Especially self-pres 6. Because self-pres 6 has a fear of being alone, but they'll be alone if it means they have to give up what makes them feel secure to be in relationship. It's a fascinating tritype, actually, but that's why, unfortunately, there's a whole group of people that didn't understand Naranjo's concept of the subtypes. And I think there are 3 different ways that subtypes are taught now. And it's like, you know, it just goes back to primal simplicity. And I take responsibility for the word one-on-one, but I had to come up with that word for business, because you can't use sexual, you can't use intimacy, especially in federal organizations like the Federal Reserve, or if you're working in a school system or state. There are certain things that can't be said, like the word spiritual. So I'd say spirited of the heart. You have to get around that. And so I started using one-to-one and one-on-one. But people that are introverted and self-pres and often 6s, they like one-to-one because it's less stressful. You can kind of feel more comfortable with one person than a group. So then people said, I'm one-on-one, so I'm sexual. But no, if you're looking for that person to be a resource as well, yeah, that's just a bonus, but you'll go without it if you're sexual, for sure. Spence?
Yeah, no, I thought that was really well put. And I very much just want to honor many things that you said, because as this tritype, I connected from the very first thing you said, right? Where you try to see like how it's going to go from the very beginning. And that is both, it's interesting how defense mechanisms work, right? They protect us against what we are most afraid of, which actually gets in the way of what we want the most.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah, it's interesting, right? If I'm afraid of someone hurting my trust, I will just not trust people, so that way I'm safe. But then I never get to feel like I can trust someone. So it creates this inner conflict between protecting the self and actually filling the need. And our tritype in particular is incredibly struggling with that inner dynamic. I am very particular about who gets let into my circles, and there's many more circles than other tritypes will have. And so I understand the whole like, well, if this goes down, it's because this and this and this between us and blah, blah, blah. And trust me, being a therapist and having knowledge of all the Enneagram stuff doesn't help. Because it's just like, oh, more knowledge that I can use to feed that train. So it sounds like it's very important to you, both what you're trying to avoid and what you're trying to attain. So I just hope that you use the powers that are within you to find that balance that both feeds and protects.
I mean, I have used my counterphobia to like, you know, I know this is gonna go nowhere, but I'm going in, but you know, I'm still keeping my resources safe. But you know, let's play this out. Even though And you know, I haven't regretted that.
Good.
Yeah, yeah. And that's how the self-pres 6 does it.
Yep.
They'll keep whatever resources they feel are important, and it varies with each self-pres.
Mhm.
And then they'll take calculated risks. And that's the important piece. It's calculated.
Yep.
Thank you so much for bringing these questions.
So thank you very much. We'll see you in about 3 or 4 months.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.